Hello, hello, and welcome back to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. I am here today with another repeat guest. So this is Brian Sanders. He's the guy from foodlies.org. He's working on a new documentary that should be out pretty soon. We'll definitely talk to him about that. But the reason he's here today is going through a bunch of YouTube videos of the day, and I see he's put out a couple videos trying to debunk game changers. I thought it was a very interesting couple of videos going over a lot of information. And since then, just so everybody knows the context that I'm recording this in, I'm recording this the day after the Chris Kresser and is it John Wilk or Josh Wilk?
James Wilks.
James Wilk, yeah, sorry. We're on the Joe Rogan podcast. So Chris Kresser kind of debunked the Game Changers thing a couple days ago on the Joe Rogan podcast. James Wilk came on the Joe Rogan podcast with Chris Kresser and defended his position, I think, a little bit more for the Game Changers podcast. And so we're recording this the day after. I definitely want to talk about veganism as in general, the Game Changers documentary specifically, and some of the problems with that. And maybe we'll get into, as much as we can, James Wilk's his position on some of the things that he brought up on Joe Rogan. If you haven't listened to the Joe Rogan podcast, I mean, it's good, but it's also 4 hours long. So maybe
it's a rough one.
Yeah, maybe wait till somebody puts out like a couple clips of it. You gotta be invested in it to make it through 4 hours. Anyway, we'll get into all that. So Brian, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, no problem. I'm very interested in what you have to say. I thought the YouTube videos that you did were good. They were high quality and they came out very fast. I mean, Game Changers has been out 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that?
I don't know. Well, I mean, we started it. This was a 25-day project. So we tried to make a feature film in 25 days. Game Changers spent 5 years and millions of dollars. And we spent 25 days and whatever we could get on Indiegogo. Actually, It was great. The community came together and helped fund this thing. So yeah, it's really hard. I mean, it seems simple when you see the end product. It's like, oh yeah, you just threw some video together and you got some interviews. Like, no, that was us staying up all night for me, luckily, my editor.
I bet. Well, that's good. So for those of you that haven't seen the Game Changers documentary yet, it's a pro-vegan. I don't know if I call it pro-vegan or just anti-meat. It's definitely it's more anti-meat than pro-vegan, I guess I would say, because they really don't want you to eat meat. They really don't want you to eat dairy because dairy gives you cancer and meat gives you a heart attack, and a lot of the same stuff that we've been hearing for years. And the documentary as a whole, I don't know that I'd recommend it, but it is available on Netflix if you want to check it out. But you're probably not going to need to have a lot of that background to get into what we're going to get into today. So, Brian, let's start with what you feel like are the most egregious errors that were on that podcast, and just start working our way down and just discuss where you think the Game Changers as a whole got it wrong.
Yeah, in the film, yeah. So the biggest premise is just if you zoom out to like 30,000 feet, it doesn't make any sense. So this is what a lot of vegans do, is they take things out of context or they stick their head in the sand and they don't even look at something from that high of a view to even see if it makes sense, right? So that, I think that's where you have to start with is humans have been eating meat for all of history. We think it made us human. Everyone's heard all this stuff before. Millions of years ago, we evolved from chimps and our ancestors, and we used fire, and we started eating meat, and our brains expanded, and we had access to high quality fats. And some people even think like marine fats, these omega-3s helped grow our brain, and we started hunting, and all these things around meat eating grew our brains. Okay, so they'll skip all that and somehow think that meat is bad. So that's the biggest thing I want to point out. And if I ever talk to this guy, James Wilks, I would focus on that. It's like, do you reconcile this in your head? Okay. How do you reconcile that we are omnivorous creatures eating meat for millions of years, yet you're saying we should not be eating meat because you're looking at these tiny myopic details and trying to prove some sort of connection that meat is bad for us? which is
Right.
I hate this, and I think a lot of scientists you're kind of getting in the minutia, and you don't look at the big picture. Where
That
you're
was
right.
that was the first thing that was one of the things that I really had a problem with him on Joe Rogan, was he really focused on a lot of trees and did not focus on the forest. When he was talking to Chris Kresser specifically about B12, he was like, Chris Kresser probably misspoke when he said that cows, didn't need to be supplemented with B12, and he said, and he proved that they did, and he was like, so you were wrong. So you're wrong about that. You're wrong about B12. You're wrong. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, he might have been wrong about that, but he wasn't wrong about the fact that vegans have to supplement B12, and there's no way around it.
And and maybe he just misspoke about the B12, or it's just not common knowledge that there is any supplementation going on at all. And I didn't really know about. I mean, actually, I have heard about it recently, and I didn't look into it fully. But no one knows. We're not cattle farmers. We don't know about the cobalt. It's actually, they're not even supplemented with B12. They're supplements with cobalt, and their rumen make the bacteria. So
right.
James is correct and Chris is correct. It's the bacteria makes the B12. But since our soil is depleted from all this monocropping, then we don't have enough cobalt in the soil, which makes the cows need to sometimes be supplemented with cobalt, which makes B12. So no one really knows about this. And so yes, it's a great tactic that James Wilks used to attack Chris and his character. Mostly, I mean, I know we're switching to the podcast with Rogan, but it's basically 4 hours of James attacking Chris's character and attacking little things that he said, even offhand things that he said on the first podcast, and not exactly. He never got to the facts of why he thinks red meat is bad. They actually never, he's talked about heme iron for a little bit, but James Wilks actually never. They kept asking him, "Why do you think red meat is bad?" And he didn't have anything to say. So back to just like the film and veganism in general is, and just science being done, is that people who are against meat eating try to purposely search and dig for things that could try to show that it's bad, which I think that's great, I guess, in a scientific nature, right? I want to always be pursuing the best information possible. And yeah, you always want to be looking for things, but sometimes it goes way too far when, they're like trying to hang on to these little things like TMAO or heme iron or new 5GC. And when you look at the big picture, it doesn't make sense, right? Because if all these people are being very healthy, and you take a country like, Hong Kong eats the most meat, yet they live the longest. So you can look this up. They have the longest lifespan. They eat the most meat. Meat was never considered bad in Hong Kong and many areas of China. It's a sign of wealth. It's a sign of prosperity. It's a sign of health. So even at the top level, just a simple thought experiment. Why are we searching for all these ways to try to say that meat is bad when we can see that it's not bad? We also can see in the Annals of Medicine, they put out 5 research papers recently showing there was no correlation between meat and cancer. They're kind of finally clearing the air that we actually looked through all these studies. And once we weighted the studies based on how accurate, and just the strength of the evidence, when we took all these weak correlations out, we actually found through this meta-analysis that there is no good connection between meat and cancer. So, there's a lot going on here. You could talk about that with each mechanism when they're trying to say, oh, new 5GC, heme iron. They're talking about like N-nitroso compounds, talking about TMAO. It's like people are desperately trying to smear meat. Like I see these studies. They're always out of Harvard. They're these vegetarian journals, and they're trying to just find a way to claim that meat's bad. But then when you zoom out, it never makes sense. And it's like, okay, we'll do TMO for a second. TMO is in fish. Like there's more, you get more TMAO eating fish, and everyone agrees that fish is good. All these Mediterranean diets are so good. Okay, so then why are you trying to smear TMAO because it's in red meat?
Right. Exactly. That was The forest for the trees argument, I always think is really, really strong, because you can pick out a particular nutrient or whatever and say, this shows to be bad, or it shows that, that it's correlated with this. But when you just look at vegans, look at the people who have been on a vegan diet for a long time, and look at people who have been on something with a lot of animal products, but very few processed sugars.
Yeah, just like a paleo person or something.
Yeah, just like a regular paleo person and a regular vegan. Put them side by side. If they've been on their respective diets for 10 years, the paleo diet looks like he could break the vegan in half. Yeah. I mean, it always looks like that 100% of the time.
Yeah. And that's another simple one. And it's funny because I debated a vegan on stage in front of 500 food industry executives. There's this big conference in Chicago that they tried to pit me against this vegan woman, and they called me a carnivore. They called her a vegan. It was kind of funny because I'm not carnivore and she wasn't vegan. She eats fish and eggs. So it's kind of funny that we like almost agree on the diet, right? It's like we're both eating animal foods. We're both avoiding processed sugars, grains, vegetable oils. You know what I mean? It's kind of funny. But also she just looked unhealthy. Like she thought I was in my 20s and I thought she was in her 50s because she looked so bad. And then I told her I'm 36 and she was like 45. So, it's just a great example. And I hate using anecdotes, but it seems to be very consistent that, after you get to a certain age and you do it long enough, the people doing the animal foods diet just tend to be healthier and look better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. So let's talk about B12 for a minute. I know we talk about how vegans, have to supplement with it, and we know where carnivore people or not carnivore, just omnivore people are getting their B12 from animal products. And one of the things Chris Kresser brought up is that we're not supplementing B12 into bivalves. We're not supplementing our fish with B12, and yet there it is. How prevalent is B12 deficiency in the vegan community, and how fast can someone who is B12 deficient, how can they turn that around by going back to eating meat?
Yeah. So I think it's about 71% of vegetarians. I should have actually got these numbers, but the vegetarians were something like 70% deficient. I think the straight vegans were even more than that. And then omnivores, people are still deficient. I think it was in the teens or 20% were deficient. But, so it's very clear the less animal foods you eat, the more deficient you are. It's also, we're telling people to not eat red meat, right? And we're saying that it's bad for you. So of course, some of these omnivores are deficient in B12 because we're telling them not to eat it and they're following directions.
Right. And yes, the other thing is what percentage of your plate is red meat. I mean, if people are following, recommendations, it's just they're eating a very small amount. They're eating it, once a day. So they are technically omnivores, but they're probably not eating enough to keep their what would you call it? To keep their
levels correct.
Levels correct. And speaking of levels, that was the other thing I wanted to touch on, supplementation. So that was one of the things that James Wilk was very adamant about, was that everyone needs to be supplementing with B12. Like everyone, 100% of people, everyone needs to be taking a B12 supplement. And it only costs $2 a year, which is, when he said that, I about fell out of my chair. That's just...
Well, he was like, yeah, if you buy it with a bunch of people, you buy your supply and you buy it with, he's talking about buying a truckload and sharing with your community.
Right. Okay.
It's very disingenuous.
Just dump it in the water at that point, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was just silly the way that he said it. Tell me your views on that. Should everyone supplement with B12?
No, I think this is insane. And I brought this up in the film that to say that he claims the best way to get B12 is through a supplement. I think that's almost verbatim. And I think that is an insane thing to say and sends a terrible message. You're saying instead of eating real foods like we've had done for all of history, that you should buy some processed chemical thing, from a factory to get B12. It's insane. That almost discredits the whole movie that you would suggest that. And then on the podcast recently, he tried to back it up by saying, "Oh, it's the most sure way to get B12 because if you take this up, right?" I think
that's what Chris Kresser kept saying. He said it was the best way, and Chris Kresser kept saying, "No, it's the surest way." And he was. I think Chris Kresser was trying to to concede that point to him that I mean, if you're taking a B12 supplement, you are for sure going to get it, but it's not the best way. I mean, who would say that it's the best way?
Well, actually, I don't even know if he should have conceded that point because I don't think it's the surest way because it's not in the most bioavailable form. And I think there are studies showing that people who supplement with B12 still are not have it in the plasma, the actual concentrations in their blood are not adequate because, as we know, all supplementation is not as efficient and as good as just eating the real thing. So I think if I was to talk to James, I would definitely push back on all this and it's insane. And I want to go back to just how he was just attacking Chris's character the whole time.
Right.
And that what a bad strategy that is. And he just seemed like a bad person. Is that, I don't even want to do it because I don't want to even do the same thing and get down on James. But it's just Chris was not prepared. He with all the information that James brought, and he was surprised, and it was kind of an unfair situation.
Yeah, and Chris is kind of a quieter. He's a methodical, quiet. He's definitely not. James Wilk is is an MMA.
He was loud. He was in your face. He was, had this British accent. But then Chris was he's just not an aggressive person. And
he's not. We need people like that.
Yeah.
And it was unfortunate that went down like that. So let's talk about protein. So protein was a little upsetting to me because honestly, for as many things as we talk about with as many things that we're talking about on the Joe Rogan podcast, as many things as we talk about with that vegans are doing wrong or getting wrong, honestly, it's the protein that for me is the crux of the situation. Now, when you look at Dr. Grieger, or you look at anyone that's been on the vegan diet for a long time, you look at them and the first word that comes to your mind is sarcopenia. I mean, the first word that comes to your mind is muscle loss because they look like, sometimes Grieger will take a picture and post it on Twitter, and it's from a certain angle, and I swear to God, it looks like an old man's head on a child's body. There's just nothing there. It doesn't look right. And in my mind, this is a direct result of eating a diet that's void of the protein that your body needs in order to keep your muscles keep your muscles at their current. We're already fighting time. Yeah. Just maintain. We're already fighting time, so we're already losing 1% of our muscle mass per year after age 30. That's already happening. And when you are eating a diet that's accelerating that problem, it makes for these long-term vegans that look like a good stiff wind could blow them away. So let's talk about protein specifically and the different amino acids because I thought that was the most interesting part of that conversation for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to start high level too, and then also bring it back to the debunk film that's on YouTube. Is that we had Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and Dr. Jamie Simon, these two women doctors who work with people every day, and they asserted very clearly in this film that I made that women need more protein. Old people need protein. They highly suggest animal-based protein for its increased bioavailability and more complete amino acid profile. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, she spends time with people on their deathbed. She works with the elderly, and always they had sarcopenia. They didn't eat enough. They weren't getting enough protein, all this stuff. So it's very, very important just on a high level. And, we have doctors talking about this in this film. So then there's two main things with protein is the amount and then the quality, right? So they spent some time talking about this in the podcast and in the film. So we'll just kind of go over. They're saying, you can get as much protein in a peanut butter sandwich or as a cup of lentils, or people always say, there's enough broccoli. Like I've seen memes on the vegetarian memes saying, there's enough broccoli there's enough protein in broccoli that would equal 3 ounces of steak. Okay, none of this. This is all out of context. It actually breaks down when you start looking into it. And so the first thing is about quantity. So, I mean, James did do a decent job of kind of backing. I couldn't follow all of it because he was like throwing numbers around in this podcast. But basically, with you're eating this plant-based protein, there's not enough it's not dense with protein, right? So you're getting a whole bunch of extra carbs with it, right? Or extra energy. So if you look at broccoli, people are like, oh, well, to get the same amount of broccoli, the same amount of protein that's in broccoli as in steak, you'd have to eat like, I forget what it is. It's like 12 cups of broccoli. You know what I mean? To actually get that. And then, so you're eating 12 cups of broccoli, your GI tract is going to be a mess. And you're getting a whole bunch of extra, well, in that case, just mostly fiber. So not that many calories. But if you're looking at potatoes or quinoa or like any other of these protein sources, you're getting a whole bunch of extra calories. Or peanut butter. Peanut butter is really calorie dense. And it doesn't have as that much usable protein in it. So the volume thing is hard, right? So just inherently, animal foods have much more protein in them per the calories or grams of the food. So, and then also just logistically, it's hard for people to get enough protein, right? So not everyone's supplementing. They don't have spreadsheets. They're not doing the stuff like these vegan athletes in the film that, like Patrick Baboumian admitted, he's like, I guess it was in YouTube videos, not the film. He's taking like 10 protein shakes a day. He's eating all this pea protein. He's doing this every 2 hours. He's doing the supplements. You look at these other successful vegan athletes, which I have no problem with. They should have just had a film saying, hey, you can be successful eating a vegan diet. But instead they made a film saying everyone should be doing a vegan diet and animal food's bad. Right? It's very different. You could have showed me Dottie Bausch and all these different cyclists and runners and the strong guy. It's like, okay, great. That guy's ripped and he eats a lot of protein from plants. Fantastic. But we're talking about the normal person. They're not out there weighing things out, using, $50 of protein supplements per day, doing all these spreadsheets and apps and tracking, right? So just from the highest level, people aren't getting enough protein, like you said, and like Dr. Gabriel Lyon said, and Dr. Jamie Seaman, right? We've seen this. So then we can talk about the protein quality. And in the film, in the Game Changers film, they say all plant foods have all amino acids. And then he's like, in varying amounts. He like quietly says in varying amounts. So I was like, all right. So yeah, there's like 0.001 grams of leucine in, wheat. So it's impossible to get enough leucine, which is what you really need to build your muscles and body and lean body mass and stay healthy from these. So you have to do all these combinations. So again, people aren't going to do, in reality, they aren't going to do all these correct combinations of like, oh, well, I need this many grams of this and this many grams of that to get this full amino acid profile.
That was one part of what he was saying that I didn't fully track. And I went back and rewound it just because there was a couple things he was saying that I wasn't 100%. So the argument that he was trying to make, I think, was that once you hit, like, I think he was talking specifically about leucine. So once you get the amount of leucine you need to repair the damage from whatever workout you just did, that leucine that you need to maintain and to build up, that once you get that, it doesn't matter. Like, you could just eat protein of any amount equal to if you're trying to get 2 grams a day, if you're a bodybuilder, eat any amount of protein to get to that point, as long as at some point in there you got the leucine. And I thought that argument was really bizarre, because the next thing he said was, just supplement, just eat a shake. I was like, why are we supplementing? Why can't we do this?
Natural,
we can either do it from a vegan diet or we can't.
Exactly, and that could be true. Yeah, I know there are studies showing that. But then there actually is a study. So Dr. Ryan Lowry and Dr. Jacob Wilson were in my film, and they do all this kind of muscle centric research, and they're legit PhDs, and they actually did one of those studies. And part of that they quoted, but they kind of misquoted it a bit, was that if you get enough leucine, you can build muscle, and that may be correct, but no one's getting that amount of leucine, for one thing. And two is that they'd have to eat way more of it to get that, right? So there's like, you could do it with whey protein. I'll make up the numbers. It's like, okay, you could have, like 50 grams of whey protein and get all this leucine, but you have to have like 98 grams of pea protein to get that leucine. So you have to eating twice as much. And for one, people aren't, even doing the supplementation correctly anyway. So a lot of these arguments break down when you really look at them. And I think one of the biggest high level arguments between plant and animal foods always comes down to that the animal foods are more bioavailable and you have to eat less of them. And that is so important because we're talking about calories. Like, I know I don't track calories and I don't promote people tracking calories, but just inherently these plant foods have way more calories to get you to the same amount of protein and the same amount of satiety. I'm really focused on satiety and being full. And I think it's all weight loss is a battle of satiety. And if you give yourself the most satiating foods, then you're going to be fine. So if you're eating all these plant foods, it's the opposite way to do it. It's kind of like, I'll go back to another thing they mentioned in the film twice. Animals are just the middlemen, right? And this is almost an argument for our side. And Chris Kresser did a good job in the first podcast talking about this. He said, yes, thank you. He did it. He was like, thank you. I mean, they're amazing middlemen. We should be very happy about this amazing job that animals do, is they take low quality, sometimes completely unusable plant foods and upcycle them into high quality, very nutrient dense, bioavailable nutrition for humans. So it's an amazing thing that these cows and other animals do, and we should embrace that because they help us bioaccumulate and concentrate more nutrition into a better package for us to eat. And that is the highest level thing you can think about of eating plant or animal foods, is that it's more nutrient dense. It's more dense nutrition.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, their ability to take grass and, the chaff from wheat and the just the leftover stuff that we can't eat, the corn cobs and the leaves from the corn and, all that stuff, and turn it into something that's protein, rich and nutrient dense and gives us the ability, to thrive as human beings. That's something that should be celebrated. And so the idea that we need to eat a diet that's totally devoid of something that has been put here by, millions of years of evolution, this co-evolution of human beings and ruminants that we've grown up together, that helped us become human beings, that our diet should be devoid of that is really, it's really a silly argument just on the face of it. And it's not it's not something that's helpful. It's not something that's that would lead to human flourishing, I would think.
Absolutely. And I don't want to, take over this and transition into the environment side, but I think it does really relate to that. Is people are saying it's like cows do an amazing, I like ruminants, right? Sheep, cows, bison, whatever. They're amazing service, not only by upcycling these nutrients, but they actually, if raised properly, can improve the environment as well. So it's really weird. The vegan people, they'll say, oh, we need to not do this anymore, but it's actually helping on both accounts. Right. And they have it kind of backwards in both cases. The only thing they have kind of correct is that the way we do modern agriculture now is bad. But I believe that's more to do with the monocropping being harmful. And then the fact that some of that stuff that is monocropped goes to cows. But again, that is a huge misnomer. That is actually not how it works. Like you said, it's these leftover products. And so we make ethanol out of corn and they eat the byproducts of that, or distillers yeast. They eat the leftovers. So it's very, very, very skewed statistics that vegans like to throw around to say that, oh, well, it takes like 1,000 acres, all these like land to do this and so many crops to feed the cow. It's been completely explained and debunked by a couple people on my podcast. Dr. Frank Mitloehner is a great one. He's a scientist. He's a PhD out of UC Davis. And if anyone wants to listen to Peak Human episode with Frank Mitloehner, he'll go over all this in detail, where it's the cows are not the problem. They are actually part of the solution. So not only can we get the nutrient dense food from them, but by them being on grass, stimulating the grass growth by eating it, moving them around and it correctly, like rotational grazing, all these different regenerative practices that are perfectly feasible to do right now. They are perfectly profitable. I know people who have gigantic 5,000 acre farms using these methods, and they don't use any herbicides, no GMOs, no nothing. It's all natural, no fungicides, and they're using plants and animals together, and it's helping the environment. The soil is improving in quality. And back to the soil B12, this farmer, Gabe Brown in North Dakota, he doesn't give his cows cobalt. They don't need B12 supplements. His chickens don't need B12 supplements because his soil is healthy. He uses natural practices that we've known for all of history. It's called no-till farming. You don't want to dig up the soil, and you don't want to leave it barren and leave it feel fallow. You want to always have cover crops on it, and you don't want to till it, and you can still grow all these different plants and animals together, and it improves the soil. He's had scientists come on his land and evaluate the soil, and it's much healthier, has much more carbon in it. He's actually pulling carbon into the soil. So they're wrong. Yeah. Always. Vegans are always wrong, is what I figured out.
It's one of the more comical, I think, vegan arguments that, we're growing all of this, we'll call it corn or wheat or whatever, and then we're feeding it to the cows, and that food needs to go to human beings, and that would, we grow more than enough, corn and wheat and everything to feed human beings. It's like, wait a minute, we're not feeding the cows the parts that humans can eat. That part can be sold for food. We could sell it to Kellogg's and make money off of it. Cows are eating the other stuff.
The other stuff. 86% of food eaten in a cow's life is not edible to humans.
Exactly.
And here's a new one. I talked to Dr. Sarah Place, who studies this as well. And she pointed me to a study that they always say, oh, for this amount of protein, the cows, it's like, I think in the film they say 6 times less protein when you feed the food to a cow. That's, I don't know where they got that from, if they're using some outdated stuff, because I got the paper and the new data shows that cows upcycle protein. It's actually 1 to 3 times more. So it's either equal or 3 times more protein that they give us by eating the low quality protein from the plant foods. So this is even in feedlots. This is not in like some magical, regenerative perfect world farming. This is just in normal beef that you can get at the grocery store. It upcycles protein 1 to 3 times when you factor in the digestibility of the protein, which you have to do, right? Because we know we can't get all the same, we can't absorb it all from these plant foods. They have different anti-nutrients that block it, or they're just not as bioavailable, not as complete. So it's on average, cows give us twice as much protein as they consume. Just remember that on average, because there's all different methods across the country. You have to realize there's so many different ways that cattle needs to be grown in different climates, and that there's a lot of variables here. But on average, it's twice as much protein that they consume.
Let's spend a few minutes talking about dairy, because that was the other thing that came up quite a bit. The idea that dairy consumption is linked with increased rates of cancer. What is your position on this?
Well, there's a complicated one. I don't think that everyone should be eating dairy. That's a very personal thing. 2/3 of people are lactose intolerant, but there's a lot of dairy that does not contain lactose, right? There's cheese and butter and cream and stuff like that humans have for, 10,000 years been figuring out ways to get it out and make it more digestible. And then there's raw dairy, right? So I don't think that we do a great job of, all this pasteurization, and that's a whole long story of big business and, government stepping in and, consolidating things and, initially for safety reasons. But really, if you can get a hold of raw dairy, it has a lot of the enzymes that help you digest things better. So even people who think they're lactose intolerant are in fact not, that once you get all the enzymes in the raw dairy that help you digest it, they do perfectly fine. So some people have problems with dairy, and maybe they shouldn't be eating dairy. And maybe that's causing some problems. And on the podcast, they did theorize about some of that could be the case. But in general, Chris Kresser referenced a study that shows a meta-analysis of all the studies that there is no association, there is no good association with dairy and cancer. That, well, do you remember the numbers? It was a total of 84. So 70% showed no connection to dairy and cancer,
Right.
and 14% showed that there was the inverse connection, right? So that shows you, that tells you something. So James Wilks, I mean, this, we don't need to cover this as much. This is just James Wilks arguing with them and all this, but just know that the best data, looking at all the data, shows that there is no good correlation. But, you know, James had this whole side where he was trying to basically attack Chris.
Yeah, I thought the dairy one, and I think he left that. I think James left that pretty quick and got to B12, because it was when they started talking about B12 that he was really hammering, you know, that he was wrong about because Chris was wrong about them supplementing B12 to cattle. It meant that he was wrong about everything.
Exactly.
And I thought that was a really disingenuous way to approach it, and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't right. And you know, there are maybe, this might be the last time we see Chris Kresser on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
But you know, it was it was good. It was good to see the other argument, because I think sometimes I get into a little bubble where I don't think vegans have any arguments whatsoever. They're just making it up. It was good to see somebody who was intelligent enough about his side of the argument to at least make me think that vegans aren't just going through life just making stuff up, because a lot of times that's what it sounds like. You know, that there's just no science. They're just making stuff up as they go. Because I remember when Chris Kresser debated Joel Kahn on the Joe Rogan podcast. That was my impression when it was done. Was Joel Kahn was just, I mean, look, it sounded like he was just making stuff up. Like he did not understand what was going on.
Or just grasping at straws. Yeah, or like latching onto a study from like the 70s. And yeah, that's what I thought. You're very correct. And that I appreciated James, and he did a lot of research and was well prepared. And that, yeah, I mean, I'm always down to hear more about the other side, and I'm glad there is some sort of information on that side, because it makes me feel better about the world that they aren't just making stuff up. Exactly. But I think it's just, you can draw conclusions. It's a good example of what happens when you kind of bury your head in the sand and go down a route and kind of put blinders on, that you can come to very different conclusions if you do that. And so that's my takeaway, is that if you spend long enough and have enough support, you know, they had a ton of money behind this film, and James talked about, he has full-time researchers. I mean, I don't know who's paying for this, but that's a lot of money and if you look hard enough, you can find these things and try to prove your point, but that doesn't mean it's true. But I do appreciate to hear, oh, okay, maybe, you know, we do give some cows some cobalt to help give them more B12 because of soil. You know, it's like, all right, fine. I'm not saying that I know everything about this stuff. And I don't think our little world should think we know everything.
Right. And it also, you know, it does go to show, and something that I probably don't say enough, is that a vegan diet is healthier than standard American diet. Anytime you compare a vegan diet to what most people are eating today, vegan diet is always going to come out on top. Always, because it is, you take out the sugar, you take out the processed grains, you take out the polyunsaturated fats, and you're probably going to have a somewhat decent, you know, you're going to have improvements in your health, I think.
Definitely short term too.
Yeah. So then the question is it the best human diet? And that's where I think the conversation breaks down, because I think once you're on it, well, I mean, we know what happens when somebody's a vegan for 10 years, for 20 years. Mm-hmm. We know what happens when you feed newborn infants a vegan diet. They die. I mean, we've just had several cases in the news of mothers basically starving their children to death because they're vegans. Their breast milk doesn't have, you know, the necessary
DHA
nutrients.
And all the different things.
Yeah. And then they transition the child over to a vegan diet, and the kid dies, and which is tragic. So, I mean, we know what happens. We know what a vegan looks like when he's been on the vegan diet for 20 years. He looks like Michael Greger, mostly. You know, we know what that looks like. So,
well, Weston Price studied this. It's like, this is James Wilks just ignoring gigantic things, and you know that every archaeologist agrees on that we were eating meat for all of history. He'll just ignore all that, or he'll ignore that Weston Price traveled the world in the early 1900s and looked at all these different populations, and none of them were vegan. Absolutely zero of them. They all regarded animal foods as the most important foods. They all gave these to pregnant women, especially around pregnancy. They gave them the most nutrient-dense animal foods, and it's just there's no. It's hard for me to even have to keep trying to tell people that vegan diets aren't correct when it's just like so the abundance of evidence is so clear that it just seems like a waste of time. But it's like we gotta keep doing it.
Keep going over. Yeah. So I think that would be my message today. If you're a vegan and you're listening to that, eat a steak, eat some eggs, eat some fish. You're probably going to come out a lot better, especially if you're already experiencing some of the health declines that you will inevitably, I think, experience when you're talking to a vegan. And that's the other thing I try so hard to remember especially when I'm on Twitter and I'm talking to some of these people, is that every time you talk to a vegan, chances are very good that you're really talking to a future ex-vegan, that they don't stick with it for long term, because eventually something goes wrong, and the smart ones figure out that it's diet related.
Yeah, that's I always say that there's a continuous revolving door of vegans, and there's I don't think there's very few. There's a couple. I mean, if there was really these really long-term vegans, they would point to them. If there's really, right, they would be famous. Everyone would be like, Dr. Greger would talk about them every day, but there's not. And yeah, I mean, there's other parts of the film too that I don't know if we have time to go over, but I could quickly do a recap of just if anyone saw the Game Changers. It's hard. I kind of want to throw this in there because so many people have seen the Game Changers and changed their diet and like, oh man, I was wrong the whole time. I'm not eating meat. And then they're just going to find worse health, right? That's why I made this film. I wasn't going to do it initially, but I threw it out to the audience, and 600 people said they'd put in a few dollars to make it. So I was like, all right, we got to make this, and it tells me just how big a problem it is, how many people are seeing that their coworkers, their friends, their family are believing it. So just a few more things. Like in the study, they show they eat a burrito with meat and cheese, and they eat a burrito with beans and avocado, and all of a sudden the blood is magically clear. And then with the vegan burrito and then the meat burritos, it's cloudy. We debunked this 3 times. And so we show this in the film. We had Dr. Jamie Seaman and 2 other scientists do the same test, and the blood was clear. And even Dr. Jamie ate a vegan burrito with a bunch of fat to match the meat burrito, and that was the cloudiest one. Mm-hmm. So this is very clear that if you're eating high fat and high carb together, you could have hypertriglyceridemia postprandially after your meal, right? That's what this is showing. It's showing that you have fuel in your blood. And so this is really, that experiment is just a good way to say, don't eat high carb and high fat together.
Right.
So they do this like ridiculous erection study where they eat a bean burrito, and then the guys had more erections overnight. Again, it's not scientific. The doctor even mentioned it wasn't scientific. It was likely because the second night they didn't do the experiment properly, because they gave them the meat burrito the first night. So the second night they were more used to the device and likely had a different experience. Mm-hmm. And we could go on and on about the mistakes and the sort of, they just use grandiosity and effects and showmanship in this film to try to prove their point, and that it all kind of is smoke and mirrors, and it kind of breaks down. And even all the athletes that they prop up a lot of them are not vegan anymore. They never were vegan, or they weren't what they said they were. So I would just check out the Game Changers Debunked film on the Food Lies YouTube channel and see for yourself.
Absolutely. So we'll cut this off right here. Brian, I really appreciate you coming on. Can you tell my listeners where they can find out about Food Lies and your social media and all that good stuff?
Yeah. I think keep it simple. Just any platform you use, search for Food Lies, and I'm probably there. And then you can go to sapien.org and just find out about everything I'm doing, the film, the grass-fed meat, and we're building some health technology to help people. So just sapien.org and just search for Food Lies.
Perfect. Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
All right, those of you that are here, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.